You and your husband take off to the Green Mountains of Vermont to celebrate your 1-year wedding anniversary. Days go by and nobody hears from you. But after a 911 call by a source claiming to know what happened, the truth becomes a devastating series of events hard to believe. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. Bolton Valley Resort is about 30 minutes east of downtown Burlington, Vermont, in the heart of the Green Mountains. Burlington is located in the northwest part of the state, the New York border just across Lake Champlain, a massive body of water over 500 square miles, with a 14-mile wide and 107-mile long stretch of shoreline. So big, in fact, part of the lake extends as far north as the Canadian province of Quebec. If Burlington rings any true crime bells, Alaskan resident and prolific serial killer Israel Keyes spent some time up in the region, stalking and then murdering an Essex Junction couple, Bill and Lorraine Currier, back in 2011. The resort at Bolton Valley has become a popular stayover for not only skiers, but campers, hikers, mountain bikers, snowboarders, and snowshoe walkers. Be it summer or winter, there is always something to do in the nearby alpine village or somewhere along the seemingly endless backcountry terrain of 5,000 acres. The fall, of course, brings in all of the nature gazers looking to take in the foliage as the leaves make their remarkable vibrant change from green to bright red, orange, and yellow. As 22-year-old Emily Ferlazzo and her 42-year-old husband Joe drive along Bolton Valley's access road on Saturday, October 16th, 2021, near about 1 p.m., an argument breaks out. They're in the van, which Joe had customized into a camper, and they've also been living in more recently. Joe later says the argument became so intense that Emily got out of the van and started walking along the main road, Route 2. In response, hot-headed Joe took off, found the closest convenience store, parked, and decided to cool off a bit before heading back out to pick Emily up where he'd last seen her. Maybe that's all they needed, an hour or so apart, to cool off. According to Joe, he waits at the store for some time, then drives to that section of Route 2 where Emily had stormed out of the van and started walking. As he slowly makes his way down the road, keeping an eye out for her, Joe later says he doesn't see Emily anywhere. Most of Vermont, especially those areas within the Green Mountains, contain dense forest, pine trees taller than buildings, and trails upon trails of wooded acres you cannot see into from the road. If you're out there walking or hiking, the terrain can sometimes feel and look the same, meaning if you happen to lose your sense of direction, it's easy to get sucked into what is an abyss of trees and shrubs and brown pine needles all over the ground. Soon, the streams and hills and valleys all look the same. So, as Joe drives along Route 2, it's not long before he realizes that Emily is either lost, someone stopped and picked her up, or she actually followed through with her plan to take an Uber home. Either way, he later says, he could not find her. Emily Ferlazzo has straight, long blonde hair past her shoulders, dazzling blue eyes, She wears glasses at times and has what family describes as a sizzling, infectious, and uncontainable personality. Her absolute love, anyone would agree, is singing. In reports, Emily's mother calls her daughter bright and sparkly. And if you've ever met someone like this, you understand what she means. Their energy is contagious and unforgettable. Emily's dog Remy, her cat Oreo, and her turtles are said to give Emily the most happiness in her life. Her job as a licensed nursing assistant matches her personality as someone wanting to help others when they so desperately need it. In high school, Emily excelled in cross-country, track, and field. She grew up in New Hampshire and, her family says, is determined to become a cosmetologist in order to help people feel better about themselves, as she herself has struggled with self-esteem issues at times. Even in her darkest moments, the family says, her hope and determination to survive shine brightly. She always perseveres and fights for what is right. Part of what's bringing Emily down these days is her husband, Joe. And yet that portion of her life is hard for friends and family to keep track of because tattoo and piercing artist Joe, along with Emily, have become isolated of late. And many believe Joe is behind it all. Most in the family do not like Joe. Not that he is almost 20 years older than Emily, but there's just something about the guy that rubs everyone the wrong way. I think we can all relate to this. You meet someone and you just get this funny feeling about them. It tells you something is wrong. They have secrets, and you probably do not want to know what they are. Something didn't click the first time we met him, Emily's stepmother later tells reporters. I don't know what it was about him, but we didn't like him. He looks evil in his eyes. One of Emily's favorite places is Hampton Beach, New Hampshire, which is along the coastline in the southern part of the state. Emily just loves it there. The high energy and young crowd fit perfectly with her animated personality. The other thing about Emily is that she had an incredible voice and would break out with a song in a room full of people, with friends, or especially around a campfire. An argument during this specific trip seemed counterintuitive to the reason behind the trip. They were celebrating their first wedding anniversary. It should be a happy moment for Emily and Joe. They should be grateful for each other, talking about years of happiness ahead. Instead, Emily is out on her own somewhere in northern Vermont, and Joe, without calling anyone to help find Emily, is now heading back home. Part of the tension could be centered around their current living conditions in the camper, which they park at Emily's parents' house. So being cooped up in such a small space could contribute to their frayed nerves. And yet Joe, many later confirm, is mainly to blame for them not having a house or an apartment. The other side of this is that, look, couples fight. It's the nature of two human beings with differences and opinions. Joe, however, has taken the situation to another level, and members of Emily's family are well aware of his abusive nature. And some have even brought up with Emily how concerned they are about this. Joe has this cagey look about him. He sports a dark black-colored beard and mustache, receding hairline leading up to short, kinky, very curly black hair tied in one of those short ponytails in the back. He has big round brown eyes and a nose ring through his right nostril. Few understand what Emily sees in the guy. But love is in the eye of the beholder. Who is anyone to judge the love Emily has for anyone? Emily and Joe arrived in Bolton around 7:30 p.m. on that Friday. Joe's sister was already there, he later says, with her ex-boyfriend, and they had rented an Airbnb at the Bolton Resort. So that's kind of where Joe and Emily were staying. They had parked their van near the Airbnb. Soon as they got there, Joe and Emily visited his sister. This was the first time Joe's sister had met Emily. Joe invited his sister to check out their camper. After that very brief tour of the van, they made plans to get together later that night. According to Joe, after his sister left the camper, he and Emily started arguing, though Joe never said what they argued about. At some point, Joe texts his sister and tells her they won't be hanging out. The following morning, Saturday, Joe contacts his sister and says he needs to take a shower inside her Airbnb. She says fine. They then talk about getting together for breakfast. Not long after, Joe's sister, her ex, and Joe drive together to grab breakfast. "Where's Emily?" Joe's sister asks. "She's sleeping in. She's not in a good mood," he says. Joe's sister later reports that Joe seemed fine that morning at breakfast. He spoke of an argument with Emily, but other than that, he presented himself as he normally would. Later on that same day, Joe inked a tattoo for his sister she'd been wanting him to do for some time. They chatted a bit. Joe gave her the impression that he and Emily fought a lot. The previous night was not out of the norm, nor was her, apparently, taking off on her own. Joe didn't even seem worried that his wife, for all intents and purposes, was missing. "We got into a big fight," Joe explains to his sister. "She ran out of the damn van. She took off. She is probably going to meet a friend or something." During the tattoo, Joe's sister says later, he seemed very distraught that they had fought and very upset. "But I didn't have any idea of what had actually happened, just that they'd had a fight." After that tattoo, Joe, his sister, and her ex head out to dinner. He seemed distant and upset, his sister later recalls. Not locating Emily on that Saturday after she jumped out of the van, Joe claims, he woke up Sunday morning and, after having breakfast with his sister at a diner in Burlington, he then took a drive and continued looking for Emily. Joe seemed better than the night before, his sister noticed that morning. Normal. With no luck on Sunday, Joe drives out of town and heads back home, or rather, where he and Emily have been parking the van lately at her mother and stepfather's house. When he arrives near 6 p.m. on Monday without Emily, her family begins to worry immediately. They want to know where she is. She's been missing now for more than 48 hours, and it doesn't seem as though Joe has done anything to find her except drive around, have breakfast and dinner with his sister, on top of giving his sister a tattoo. Where is she? Emily's parents want to know. "We argued while in Bolton," Joe explains. "She tried to leave, and I tried to restrain her, but she kicked me in the groin." So now we have another variation of the story. In further talking to him, Emily's parents get a strange feeling that something is off with the guy. This is not like Emily at all. And why hasn't anyone heard from her? "I left to go to the store," Joe adds. "She told me she'd get an Uber home." They ask him where he looked for her. "I went to the store," Joe explains, adding how he went back to that area where she had got out of the van, but she wasn't anywhere around. "I haven't seen her since," he says. The entire conversation is unnerving for Emily's parents. Some of what Joe says doesn't add up. Did he have an argument with her and she took off on foot? Did she jump out of the camper after they left the resort? And why in the hell would he leave the area without his wife or make sure she got a ride home? It's time, Emily's parents decide, to call police and have them sorted out. But most importantly, find Emily. My longtime listeners know that I rarely suggest podcasts. Yet a good friend who is responsible for bringing me into the podcast arena, Lauren Bright Pacheco, an incredibly detailed and tenacious Emmy Award-winning producer, investigative journalist, and veteran podcaster, just launched her latest, Murder on Songbird Road, a multi-part limited series from iHeartMedia focused on the stabbing death of 11-year-old Jade Marie Beasley in the contentious conviction of her father's fiancé. I cannot recommend this series enough. You can listen to Murder on Songbird Road on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows. Let's take our first break here and come right back. You hear me say this a lot on the show. The truth should never change. Parts may vary, details might be forgotten, but the foundation of the truth should always remain constant and unshakable. Investigators understand, perhaps more than most people, that liars and the lies they tell crumble like dry cake if you apply just a slight bit of pressure by asking certain questions. Little pieces of the big lie fall away, and you are left with various scenarios defying explanation. You trip up the liar, in other words. If you recall, Joe has told many different versions of the same story. Say, for example, why hadn't Joe Ferlazzo gone to police himself? Big red flag. It's now Monday evening around 7 p.m., and it took Emily's parents hearing what they perceived to be bullshit spewing from their son-in-law's mouth to call the police. The other issue becomes, where did Joe go? He spoke to Emily's parents, explained what was going on, and then he took off. Which is very odd. Why not stick around and answer any questions police might have for you? Another huge red flag. As word goes out, Emily is described by police as 5 feet tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, about 125 pounds. She is said to be last seen wearing trendy, torn blue jeans, white sneakers, and a long-sleeve black shirt. No one has heard from her now since Friday night. In these situations, the first order of investigative business is to find someone who has seen the missing person after the person who reported them missing has seen them. So they go to the convenience store in Bolton where Joe had explained he last saw his wife. But nobody there reports seeing anyone matching Emily's description. You see, Joe had said she was headed toward the convenience store. According to media reports and later court testimony, certain members of Emily's family had met Joe only one other time. The guy kind of stayed in the background, quiet, elusive, and sketchy. And if you watch or listen to even a little bit of true crime, it's no secret that the husband of a missing wife is not only the first person to look at closely, but a likely candidate as a person of interest in their disappearance. Emily has this deep, non-judgmental way of reaching out to help other people, regardless who they are, expecting nothing in return. She loves animals. She appreciates the simple things in life. The fact that her family didn't really know much about Joe was not something anyone had been too concerned about, seeing that Emily always had a way of handling things herself. Emily's mother and stepfather, however, begin to look back as they wait to hear from her, and within that history of the marriage are signs of trouble. There were times when Emily would show up and have obvious bruising on her body, Emily's mother later tells Court TV's Julie Grant. So her parents suspected Joe was hitting her, and yet they did not have much more evidence than their observations to do anything but point it out to Emily. Domestic violence is an epidemic in the United States, as most of you know. And one of the hardest decisions for the abused woman to make, mainly out of fear, is to come forward and make the claim. Emily had never come out and said she was scared of Joe. As her stepfather told Julie Grant, Emily has always been a loyal person, someone who would give people chances to make amends. You have to keep in mind, in these cases of coercive control and abuse, the victim faces a terrible dilemma, including shame and retaliation for speaking out while living in fear of never being able to get away from the abuser. We couldn't really talk to her about what we suspected, Emily's stepfather went on to say, because she would immediately tell him, and then suddenly she would have new bruises. This is all part of a common toxic paradigm within abusive relationships. The abuser, utilizing those coercive control tactics, keeps the victim inside a box, and the victim becomes terrified of talking about it or going to someone. In certain situations I have seen, the abuser makes it clear to the victim that if anyone else finds out the truth, they will become targets. It's a dangerous cycle. The abuser is not only an expert at controlling, but works very hard to maintain authority over. We've heard the phrase frozen in fear before, or the person so afraid they are unable to move. We see this in rape cases. It's a natural response to stress and danger. The person is extremely alert within the situation, but unable to act. Think about being so terrified you become immobilized. A domestic abuse situation can have the same effect, basically. Living in that camper is one example of how Joe perhaps yielded control over Emily, i.e., he could always keep an eye on Emily, and she is never far from his grasp. My bet is he dropped her off and picked her up every day at work. Also, Emily's mother says that Joe never allowed Emily to go anywhere with anyone else. He would always insist on going. That's a big, huge sign that some coercive control is going on. He isolated Emily, shadowed her life. She became an object to possess. The abuser takes advantage of the forgiving nature a victim might harbor, and Emily was always more than willing to talk things out and listen and forget. Joe knew this. He used it to his advantage. It is all about power and control for these guys. They are so insecure, so caught up in their own failures in life, they project it all onto their chosen victim. These kinds of cases, when I see weak men controlling women, the gaslighting and psychological games they play display the depths their lack of confidence can sink to. Not to mention how they put themselves in a godlike position within someone's life. When we catch these guys and get them into court for the abuse, we must demand that judges do everything in their power to give them the harshest mandatory sentences they can, and most importantly, hold them to those sentences. I have seen so many damn times that these violent men, given chance after chance, paroled early, are allowed to re-offend. It's sickening. And violence begets violence, don't forget. They get away with a beating. The next time, that beating becomes more savage. If you are noticing parallels with Emily's case and that of Gaby Petito, you are spot on. Gaby Petito and her fiancé, Brian Landry, were traveling across country in a camper van. In August 2021, just a few months before Joe and Emily took off for the Green Mountains, Gaby went missing in Wyoming. Landry then drove back to Florida without her, showed up at his parents' house, but refused to talk about what might have happened to Gaby. Landry then took off as investigators put the squeeze on, demanding answers. Not long after, Gaby Petito's body was found in Wyoming. She had been strangled and beaten to death. Landry's body was then found sometime later. He had shot himself. Gaby Petito, like Emily, was just 22 years old. And of note, Gaby and Emily could have easily pulled off being sisters. They look so much alike. Another alarming part of this is that domestic violence is behind half of all homicides in the state of Vermont. 50%. And the level of violence within those crimes is increasing, as we will soon see in this case. It's almost as if in these spousal situations, murdering someone is just not enough anymore. Investigators are quick to pick up on the similarities, seeing that the Gaby Petito case had unfolded recently with a gargantuan media presence. And they wonder right away if what they are looking at with Emily and Joe is a similar situation. Investigators then get a solid lead that Joe is at a convenience store in St. Albans, Vermont, about a half hour north of Burlington. His sister lives in town. Part of this is concerning because the Canadian border is not that much further north. And so the worry is that Joe could be looking to get out of the country. They arrive in the early afternoon on that Tuesday, and they find Joe inside the store. He still has not contacted authorities about his missing wife, which tells authorities all they need to know. "Hey, Joe," an investigator says. Joe has this look on his face, as if the race is over and time is up. He's caught. "We'd like you to come down to the barracks and talk to us." Joe agrees. By the time they pick Joe up, investigators know for a fact Joe murdered Emily, and they have hard evidence to back it up. Early on Tuesday morning, just after midnight, a friend of Joe's called 911 to report that Joe had just told him he murdered Emily, and her body is inside their camper van, which is parked at his sister's residence in St. Albans. To that friend's credit, and man, do we need more people like this dude, he and Joe were driving along in the guy's Jeep Wrangler when Joe blurted out what he'd done, and so Joe's friend pulled over, kicked his ass out of the vehicle, and phoned into 911 immediately. If he hadn't done that, I think, Joe was probably going to take the cowardly way out and kill himself, or head into Canada on the run. By the time Joe is inside State Police barracks, wrapped up in a blue blanket with a cup of hot coffee in front of him, as if he is some sort of survivor from a capsized boat, they have already seized the camper van, gone through it, and understand the absolute gruesome nature of what Joe did. The idea here is to get Joe to admit it himself, make everyone's life a bit easier. You see, sadly, quite disturbingly, Joe not only murdered his wife by shooting her 2 times in the head after he placed a pillow over her face, but he did the unthinkable afterward. Let's take our final break here, come right back, and get into that part of this case next.
Do you remember cutting her up?
I have one flash of memory where I cut into her leg with a knife, and then I stopped. It made me sick, and I remember being sick. Like nauseous and vomiting, and that's all I remember is being sick.
Just once?
No, I drank. I drank and got sick multiple times. But I don't remember any other part of that incident.
To listen to Joe Ferlazzo there not want to recall what he did tells me a lot about this guy. He's insecure and cowardly. Here he is in court during his trial being asked to explain his actions, which he'd already done to police during interviews. They want him to talk about the brutal nature of his crime after killing Emily. And Joe sits there and plays the stupid "I cannot recall" card. It's all a freaking show. A careful design by a slick sociopath. Joe wants the jury in this situation to feel some sort of empathy for him. Another game of manipulation and control. Joe understands clearly this will be his only chance. Fact is, Joe claims self-defense, telling jurors that he shot Emily because she came after him. Yes, you heard it correctly.
And she started just coming up at me, and I just fired.
Why?
She was going to shoot me.
And you were afraid?
Very.
He says Emily, in an explosion of rage, went at him with a gun, and he was terrified she'd shoot him. My wife went berserk, completely psychotic, he says. But then how would he explain that he told police Emily was lying on the bed in the camper, and he got up, grabbed his Glock handgun, which he kept in a cabinet, jumped on top of her, and shot her twice in the head? Evidence proves as much, as the prosecution during his trial presents a pillow from inside the van with 2 bullet holes in the corner. The gruesome part of the crime Joe cannot seem to explain certainly would not make sense in the context of Emily going after him. That is why Joe won't talk about it. And not for nothing. But Emily attacking Joe, of course, goes against everything Emily stood for and anyone that knew her would ever describe as her demeanor or temperament. Not to mention the size difference between the two of them. Still, after he kills Emily, Joe dismembers her body piece by piece and places those body parts in garbage bags with the hope of covering up the murder. And remember, afterwards, he has breakfast with his sister and her ex. He tattoos his sister. Then he has dinner, and then another breakfast the following morning. The entire time, with Emily's body parts inside the van he is driving around in. In his sociopathic and pathetic mind, he wants us to believe that this young woman, who could have never overpowered him, turns into a vicious, angry killer and goes after him.
Mr. Ferlazzo claims that he doesn't remember what he told police, that he doesn't remember being in the interview with police, and that he doesn't remember much of the night he killed her, and that his memories were not full at the time and are still fragmented. Luckily for Mr. Ferlazzo and for all of us, every single word that Mr. Ferlazzo said to the police about what happened to Emily was recorded. The reason that Trooper Cody turned on his body camera when he called Mr. Ferlazzo. The reason that Detective Voris did the interview in a room equipped with video and audio. The reason that Detective Voris made sure to have an extra recorder on his body when he went into different places, went to the breaks, went to the holding cell, just in case.
That was Prosecutor Sarah George during her closing statement rebuttal during Joe Ferlazzo's trial. The focus on recording Joe's interviews with investigators is to explain that Joe can say all day long he doesn't recall speaking to police and that he was in some sort of mental blackout and breakdown, but the tape doesn't lie. The guy knew exactly what he was doing when he murdered Emily and later dismembered her. And he sat and he told police all about it. In fact, he even told police that he planned Emily's murder. Joe's attorney took things to an embarrassing and disgusting level by telling jurors Emily abused Joe, that he was the victim. Quote, "Is this someone that had been pushed to the point they could no longer tolerate getting hit?" his attorney says about Joe. I've seen and heard a lot, but that is a special kind of bullshit. Joe's trial lasts 5 days. He testifies, as you heard, yet has nothing to say. Every piece of evidence points to Joe Ferlazzo killing Emily and dismembering her corpse. There is no other explanation. And after listening to Joe explain how he killed Emily and how he tried to hide what he did, even after Joe says he did it all in self-defense, jurors take a few hours and find his ass guilty. Something I heard Emily's mother say after the verdict struck me. Quote, "For me, it was really just relief and feeling like we got the justice that Emily deserves." That is so well said. Relief and justice. Another scumbag is heading to prison forever. You never have to think about him again. And your focus can be on memories of your lost loved one. Relief and justice. Joe is sentenced to a minimum of 35 years. I know that sounds crazy to think that a guy who did what Joe Ferlazzo did could walk the streets again, but this is Vermont. It's one of those states where these type of sentences are common. If this crime had taken place in Florida or Texas, Joe Ferlazzo would have likely faced lethal injection, or, at a minimum, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lady Justice, I think, in some jurisdictions, needs a makeover. And before I go, please get over to patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps and sign up for my free content page, where I'll be interacting with you, doing live streams, posting exclusive content, sending out newsletters, and dropping a major limited series podcast exclusively for Patreon members later this year. That's patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. That's it for this week. Be safe. Be aware. Sources for this episode include court transcripts and video testimony. Jury finds Joseph Ferlazzo guilty of first-degree murder. NBC5, December 16th, 2024. New Hampshire man admits to killing his wife in Bolton. 7daysvermont.com, Sasha Goldstein, October 19th, 2021. Vermont versus Joe Ferlazzo, affidavits and search warrants. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.